They called him the village's shield. When smoke darkened the valley and raiders came like wolves, they called his name and the danger folded. When floods rose and crops failed, he walked the riverbanks and rerouted water with hands that knew how to bend earth. When thieves preyed on the weak, he stood in the square with a quiet that felt like a promise. I will not let you pass. His name was Kalen, and for 20 years he wore the village's safety across his broad shoulders like armor. Kalen was not born for glory. He was born for labor, calloused palms, a small home, and a woman named Mara, who made the weary mornings softer with soup and small, impossible laughter. They married with a handful of coins and a vow that was spoken cheaply but kept dearly. Protect the village, and I will keep the hearth. He kept his side of the bargain like a man cutting stone. Precise, relentless. He cut down wolves, negotiated with merchants, took watch for nights. Others would not. He led scouts into enemy lands and bargained away his own comfort so that the children ate. Because of him, the village prospered. Because of him, parents slept. Because of him, elders who smelled of old stories lived long enough to pass on their tales. In the market, mothers whispered his name with the kind of gratitude that lives heavy in the chest. Children would follow him like little shadows, fingers sticky with bread, eyes wide with trust. He had become more than muscle. He had become the village's first instinct against harm. But that trust, like any insistence of the many upon the few, had a cost. Kalen's life crested outward into responsibility so wide that the small things, Mara's quiet ache, the softness in her voice when she asked for an extra hour at the loom, the way she watched the window when he left at dawn, were folded into the village's needs and pressed flat. He left before dawn and returned late, smelling of iron and rain, and gradually his home grew quieter as the world he protected grew louder. In the beginning, there was gratitude. Then there were murmurs. Murmurs become questions when water runs low or taxes bite, and a question becomes a fault line if you keep walking across it without noticing how the land shifts beneath your feet. It began with small betrayals that tasted like paper, an unpaid debt, a favor called in that never returned. A merchant who once promised lower grain but raised it higher. A neighboring lord who demanded rights over grazing in exchange for silence. Kalen bargained, bartered, and took blows into his skin so the village did not have to. Each time he traded for mercy, someone else's ledger recorded a debt they would not see on the surface. Names he asked to be spared, trades he made that left a stain. He kept those stains hidden. That is what protectors do. The first open sign came on evening, when the winter came early and the river swelled angry. A band of raiders, fierce, well-armed, crossed into the valley under a sky the color of old bones. Kalen fought them off at the ford, his blade a poem of muscle and will. By dawn, the raiders retreated, but not without a price. Houses burned at the village's edge. A child's laughter was replaced by silence. Kalen's shoulders held the weight of the bodies he could not save. His eyes held the names of those he could not bring back. It was then he began to notice the looks, small slants of resentment that had nothing to do with gratitude. It echoed in the market, when his absence meant someone lost a season's harvest. It sat in the tavern when he returned with a debt to repay. People who had once called his name in thanks now muttered about the decisions he had made in their name. He was their shield. They had never learned to carry one themselves. And yet, he could not stop. He could no more abandon the village than he could stop his own heart. Each time the horn sounded or the smoke rose, he put himself between the danger and the children sleeping under thin quilts. It became a covenant not only to the people, but to himself. He would not, could not, allow harm to touch them if he could lift a stone, swing a blade, or bargain with a voice only used for hard things. Love is sometimes a small abrasion, wearing away at what you hope will last. Mara loved him like a slow, sure river, steady, broad, giving. She bore his absences with a smile that ached. She tended the hearth, mended cloaks, whispered stories to strangers who came for bread. The children loved her because she had a way of remembering small things. One child's favorite berry, another's fear of thunder. To the village, she was the quiet queen of the home, always soft, always present. To Kalen, she was the only warm place he ever wanted to return to. Years passed. Raiders came and were repelled. Fires were fought. Negotiations were won by Kalen's wry tenacity. He became a man of scars that read like a map, each line a place where his body had stood between danger and the people behind him. Yet the map also showed the thin cracks along which resentment now traveled. There were new faces in the market, men who sold knives with less mercy, merchants who smoothed their tongues and left poison in their ledgers. The village had prospered, yes, but prosperity puzzles the soul. Those who prosper may forget where their safety began. The first betrayal that cut like a blade was not from a stranger. Letters were delivered in secret, promises of gold if the valley's defenses were left open, a promise of peace if certain gates were unguarded. Someone within the village's inner circle had been talking to men from the hills. Crops vanished overnight at the storehouse. A sentry, once staunch, was found collapsed near a poisoned cup. Suspicion swelled. Kalen's eyes scanned familiar faces and saw patterns, but nothing concrete. His investigations touched nothing but air. There were 1,000 theories. The blacksmith with a new wife and a wallet a little fuller than before. The elder with a political itch, who argued for compromises Kalen could not abide. The captain of the guard, a man of rules, who had lost a son and carried a bitterness no one comforted. Suspicion had a way of wearing many masks. The village found it easier to believe in many small sins than to imagine a single, deliberate conspiracy. All the while the enemy, men with crowns of iron and tongues like knives, moved through the hills making offers and opening pockets. They spoke of trade and safety, of taxes that would buy peace. They asked for a name. They wanted the man who had kept the valley safe. With him gone, the world would be soft to their hands. They brought with them a plan that was patient and cruel, the type that worms through loyalty like ivy through a fence until the structure gives. Kalen found a clue one autumn when the leaves were brittle with frost. A map, folded small and hidden in the thatch of a barn, marked with times and pathways, routes through the wood that only someone who knew the valley could show. Kalen traced the ink into his memory and tasted betrayal like copper on his tongue. He looked at the faces in the square and felt nothing but a hollow cold. He began to suspect voices that once comforted him. He confronted men in the guardhouse with the quiet of a man who has seen too many fall. He offered them soft words and sharp questions. Some confessed small sins, pacts made for coin, a favor returned too late. None admitted the full shape of the plot. The village fractured into murmur and blame, and that fracture carved new space for those who would finish the job. In the winter of thin moons came the trade that would break him. A messenger arrived in the night with a chalice of poison disguised as medicine for a sick child. The village's well had been sullied, salt in the granaries, fever in the halls. Panic rose. Kalen ran from one house to the next, carrying hope in bundles and making order where fear wanted chaos. He found no relief, only more questions and a signature that matched a ring he had seen on a man who dined often with the elder. He assumed the elder's hand, the trusted one. He assumed because he could not think that Mara, his Mara, the woman who mended his shirts with the patience of prayer, could be anything but faithful. Love is its own blindness. He could not conceptually allow the thought. She was where the hearth stayed warm. She was where his children slept. She was the voice that soothed his nights. No man noticed the small calculations in a woman's heart until the math is too late. Kalen believed in the steadiness of her, and that belief became armor, and also the wound that opened him. That winter, the enemy sent a small army with banners black as grief. Kalen called the men, and the young men, and the ones who used to be boys. He organized defenses, lined the passes, and lit the beacons. They fought through the night. They fought like a man can when he has nothing left to bargain with but his life. Kalen led charges, while the men behind him held line. He watched the young drop like fruit, and each fall was a stone in his gut he carried forever. Victory tasted like ash. The raiders were beaten back, but this victory had been purchased in fear. The enemy retreated into the hills, taking with them a knowledge of where the village's weak points lay, because someone had opened a gate. Kalen scorched that knowledge with search and hunger, but the truth receded like an animal into burrows men could not reach. It was after this that the offers increased. They arrived with softer tongues and heavier purses. "Help us, and we will take your burdens," they said. "Help us, and you will not have to fight." In the shadow of the last campaign, the village grew fragile and tempted. The idea of leaning on someone else for the weight of defense became seductive. Kalen saw a community fray at the edges, and he tried to sew it back with old stitches, watch patrols, rations shared, nights doubled on guard. But resentment breeds cunning. There was a meeting in the elder's house, a meeting about terms and future, and, Kalen would later learn, a price to be paid. He had trusted the elder to negotiate for the village. He had not imagined the elder negotiating for himself in a way that sold Kalen's name in exchange for safety. Then the worst happened. Kalen was betrayed in the one way no shield can bear, a betrayal of the heart. They drew him into a trap, as if to show the world that his armor was brittle. A messenger came with a beacon, asking for help at the ford. Kalen rode out at dusk, with the faithful at his side, expecting bandits. Instead, the trap starved them of daylight and filled it with men from the hills, armed and waiting. Arrows came like rain. The faithful tried to hold line. Kalen moved with the grace of trained habit, parrying death itself for the others. He killed many men. He saved many more. But the tide turned because someone had betrayed their knowledge of his routes and the timing of patrols. He awoke later, midwinter night, cold, and the world smelling faintly of blood. He found his men tended in the square, some alive, some not. Kalen staggered to the gate of his house, and there stood Mara, her hands stained, not with the soot of hearth fires, but with the callous of decision. She looked at him and did not weep. That absence of grief shaped a canyon in him that would never fill. He asked the question that is unforgiving. Did you know? Mara's silence was a thing he had never learned how to answer. Finally, she spoke, and her words fell like small stones into a river he had not thought to cross. I had to, she said. He wanted to tell himself that there were reasons: blackmail, threats, enemy hands at her throat. She had always been practical. Perhaps in a pinch, she had chosen what seemed the smallest harm. He wanted that because believing otherwise would be more painful than anything his body could survive. He pressed it like a wound between fingers and hoped the infection would not spread. He asked where, who, when. Mara told him, half-truths like those a woman tells when she is protecting a shame. She told him of a child with a fever and a promise made beneath the eaves. Give us the man, and we will spare your kin. She said names, she whispered like a prayer, and left out the ones that would break him. Kalen wanted to understand, to forgive, because he loved her, and because to hate his own hearth would be to lose the last warmth in the world. He wanted the explanation that would leave him with a reason to go on. Who gave the ring? He asked, voice a thread in the dark. She could not say. Forgiveness, when given too quickly, can be its own violence. He wrapped his arms around the only human he ever wanted to hold and pretended to breathe. For the rest of that night, they lay together under thin blankets, two bodies conjoined by choice and betrayal. In the morning, he stepped outside with a face like stone and walked among the morning smoke as if he were not the carry of the village, but something foreign. He tried to find the true paths of betrayal, men with pockets fuller than their morals. Each clue he chased led only to more people who had been tempted by coin, fear, or a crooked appetite. Accusations scattered the village. The blacksmith was found with goods he could not explain. The guard captain drank himself into silence. Fingers pointed like crooked vines. The elder sat in his house like a man waiting to be visited by fate. Kalen kept returning to that night's hollow place where arrows had bitten the earth. He felt exposed in a way his armor could not prevent. Time did not heal so much as it rearranged the shards into new patterns. Kalen continued to protect. He continued to be the shield, and the village continued to trade in whispers. Life moved forward with an awkward grimness. Each winter he fought, someone would sell a passage, someone would open a gate, someone would trade their neighbor's blood for bread. The pattern was subtle and savage. The village wanted safety, but not the price of vigilance. They wanted peace, but were willing to offer another man's life. Years turned. Kalen grew older. His hair shot with gray, the scars mapped into deeper ridges. Mara's steps took on a different cadence, less the quick hum of domestic order, more the measured step of someone carrying a secret. She would stand sometimes at the edge of town, watch the hills with the look of a woman who had bargained with the dark and returned with coins too heavy to carry. He never forced her to answer. The question had become a wound between them, pulsing but not oozing. He kept his love like a shield, too proud to lower it even when the weight bent him. Then came the winter that finished everything. A century of small treacheries had grown into a larger plan. The enemy sought to take the valley, not with a simple raid, but by drawing the village into a web it could not escape. Starvation, taxes, internal rot. They would buy the corruption directly. They bribed the baker to bake bread with salt, that sapped hunger into weakness. They paid the ferrymen to take the grain away. They signed contracts with men of the village who needed coin. The plan required a delivery. Kalen. They wanted him dead so that no one would lead the defense when their main army descended. Someone in the village would show them where Kalen planned his watches, and they would come at dawn when the men were asleep. On the night the army came, the alarm came too late. Someone had left a lantern at the northern pass, the signal for the enemy column to march. Kalen ran into the dawn like a bull into a storm. He cut through the ranks with a ferocity that had made songs of him. He saved lives. He took bodies as if they were the cost of a hard calculation. He fell into exhaustion and blood. And then, because the world is a merciless geometry, he was surrounded by directions given by a hand he knew. The lead of the enemy came not from a stranger, but from Mara. She stood when the dawn was pale, a lantern in hand, her face stone. She walked out and met him among the smoke and the sounds of battle, and there was no pleading in her eyes, only a resignation like someone who has spoken to death and agreed a price. He fought until the strength left him. He killed many of the men and broke the plans that would have swallowed the valley easily. But the enemy had numbers and knowledge and the kind of patience that wears down the determined. He was struck by a spear in the chest. The world narrowed. He staggered, then sank. The light went warm and thin as a coin. He saw the faces of the men he had saved drift by like lanterns. He saw the village, his village, on the edge of a new quiet. He looked up and saw Mara standing in the smoke. The lantern was a small sun in her hand. Her cheeks were wet. She had her lips pressed as if to keep something from being heard. When she knelt by him, she smelled of cedar and old promises. "Kalen," she said, voice too flat to hold the syllable. He could barely breathe. He tried to draw anger like breath, but only found a deep animal grief. Why? His voice scraped. He wanted fury and found only a tiredness so enormous it could have been a third thing. A pity he had for everyone in this story, even the one who had betrayed him. Mara's hands trembled as she touched the wound. Her fingers were as gentle as the woman who had mended his shirts. But those fingers were the same ones that had guided the enemy's march. She pulled his head into her lap, and the world tightened to the pulse in his neck. "I did it for them," she said, like a prayer that had become a sentence. "I did it to save the boy with the fever, to save the mothers, to stop the taxes that would have taken everything. I chose a path I thought would buy mercy." He wanted detail. Names, the ring, the bargaining. But as the life left him, the veil thinned. He saw memory after memory. Nights when she called his name softly. Mornings when she laughed at a child's joke. Hands that held his. He remembered the year she gathered coal to heat the newborn. How she had worn his cloak when he went to fight. He wanted her to be the woman he had loved and trusted. And now, he asked, because even at the deathbed, the mind wants to be fair. She closed her eyes as if to hold something in. When she spoke again, it was not a defense, but a confession. "I thought if I gave myself a small sin, it would buy them 1,000 mercies," she said. "I thought if I gave you to them, they would not take the rest. I thought I could bargain with their cruelty." Her breath hitched. "I thought a soldier's death would be a single price that would keep the village whole." He could see her thinking back to the moment she had handed the map, the way the men of the hills had smiled when they believed she would lead them where he kept his watches. She had been more than a messenger. She had been the one to place the lantern. "You loved me?" His voice was a thread. She smoothed his hair, like one might smooth the edge of a memory. "I loved you like the only prayer I could make. I loved you, and I thought it would be enough." He looked at her, at the woman who had buttered his bread and warmed his nights. He saw the whole of their life, both the tenderness and the betrayal, rolled into that small, pale morning like a last coin. He felt rage, but the rage slid off the bigger, wetter thing in his chest, a sorrow so enormous it washed out the shape of anger. He could have wanted vengeance, words that would scar, but his mouth only formed a small set of words as the light thinned. "Forgive me," he said, because there was nothing else he could say that would not make the air a worse place to leave for both of them. She sobbed then, a terrible sound, the kind that breaks the ribs of silence. She pulled him close and pressed her face into his chest. He felt the warmth of her body and the cold that had been given to others by her hands, and for a moment all the years folded into a single long exhale. Kalen's eyes closed like curtains. He breathed once, twice, and then he did not breathe again. The village woke to a different kind of silence, a silence that was not simply the absence of noise, but the presence of a truth too heavy to carry. Mara wandered the streets, with the lantern now cold in her hand, her steps aimless, her eyes hollowed. The elder, who had made bargains for coin, fled to the hills and then to a foreign shore. The blacksmith's wallets were empty of coin because coin could not purchase absolution. The captain of the guard grew small, sodden with regret. They built a mound for Kalen on the hill where the view took in the river and the roads he had once watched. Children left small tokens, stones, flowers, because they had loved what he had given them, safety. The village renamed the hill, but no name could fix the fraying. Mara sat by the mound and pressed her forehead to the earth. She wept, and she whispered apologies like a litany. In the years that followed, the valley learned to be quieter with its gratitude. They spoke his name in a softer voice and taught their children how to carry burdens rather than outsource them to a single man. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind came down from the hills and made the trees whisper like old soldiers, villagers swore they could hear Kalen's boots on the path, footsteps that kept vigil beyond the grave. Mara remained as a woman shaped by terrible choices. She held a life without solace, an existence where the hearth burned, but her hands could not warm the grief. Sometimes people pitied her, sometimes they hated her, but mostly they could not look at her without remembering the weight of a single betrayal. She would linger at the gate of the village where the lantern had burned its last and wonder if she had done right by that bargain she had made on behalf of many. The story of Kalen became a legend with teeth. Mothers told it to children as a lesson and a warning. Love the people you love, but do not make bargains that ask another to die for your comfort. Protectors must be shared. Trust must not be a one-man burden. And in the middle of the cautionary tale, there was an ache, a human place where love and betrayal braided together until it was impossible to untangle. The tragedy was not merely that a warrior died. The tragedy was that the village had been built on the back of one man's sacrifice, and when the cost became too obvious, they sold that man away to buy a brittle peace. The worst cut was that the hand that lit the enemy's lantern was the one that had once warmed his head. In the end, they whispered his name with a new tone, less proud, more careful. They kept the hill, and they remembered, and they taught. Mara stayed, living as one who had given everything and been given nothing in return but the sound of her own confession. The lantern at the northern pass remained unlit for seasons. Sometimes children placed stones there and left them as if to patch a wound. A legend is a story told with the cruelty of truth and the tenderness of regret. Kalen's story traveled, not because it was clean or neat, but because it was honest and painful and impossible to forget. It is a story about what happens when a community leans too long on one person, about the small, corrosive bargains people make when they are frightened, and about the way love can be both a cure and a poison. Remember, Kalen, when you pass a hill and think of the men who stand between you and danger. Remember, Mara, when you lay your head down next to the one you love. Remember that sometimes the hand that warms you can also be the hand that hurts you most, and that forgiveness is a thing we ask of others but rarely offer to ourselves. Welcome to Realm of Stories, where the shield may fall and the truth will always, finally, be the heaviest thing we carry. Hit the subscribe button now to follow for more content. Remember to like, comment, and share this story.